In the heart of Babylon's imperial power, a golden statue 90 feet high commands worship from all peoples and nations, its dedication ceremony orchestrated by King Nebuchadnezzar to consolidate religious and political authority through enforced uniformity. When 3 Jewish exiles, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse to bow before the idol, citing allegiance to a god who forbids such worship, they trigger a confrontation that will test whether faith can survive when the alternative is execution by fire. The king, enraged by defiance from subjects he elevated to positions of authority, orders the furnace heated 7 times beyond its normal temperature, transforming an execution device into an inferno that kills the soldiers who approach it. This is the story of men who choose certain death over compromise, who walk into fire rather than betray their convictions, and who discover in the midst of flames that sometimes the most dangerous act of courage is simply standing still when everyone else is bowing down, maintaining allegiance to the invisible when the visible power demands submission, backed by the ultimate threat of annihilation through burning. The golden statue dominates the plain of Dura like a monument to imperial ambition made manifest, 90 feet of precious metal gleaming under the Mesopotamian sun, its proportions deliberately overwhelming to inspire awe and submission in equal measure. Nebuchadnezzar has spared no expense in its construction, commissioning the finest craftsmen in Babylon to create an image that represents not just religious devotion, but political unity, a physical embodiment of the empire's power and the king's authority to command not just actions, but allegiance, not just obedience, but worship. The dedication ceremony brings together satraps and prefects, governors and counselors, treasurers and judges and magistrates and all the officials of the provinces, a gathering of the empire's administrative apparatus, arrayed on the plain in hierarchical precision, thousands of men whose presence communicates both the reach of Babylonian power and the expectation of absolute conformity to royal decree. Among the assembled officials stand 3 young Jewish men who have risen improbably high in the imperial bureaucracy, despite their status as exiles from a conquered nation. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, names given to them by Babylonian authorities to replace their Hebrew identities of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, have distinguished themselves through administrative competence and the favor they found through their friend Daniel's interpretation of the king's dream years earlier. They wear the robes of high office, stand in positions of honor near the front of the assembly, and carry the authority of men whom the king has personally elevated to govern portions of the province of Babylon. But beneath the Babylonian names and the imperial robes, they remain fundamentally Hebrew, shaped by the law given at Sinai, bound by commandments that prohibit the worship of graven images, their allegiance to the God of Israel non-negotiable, even when that allegiance conflicts with the demands of the most powerful monarch in the known world. The herald's voice carries across the plain with practiced authority, proclaiming the decree that will transform this dedication ceremony from celebration into crisis. When you hear the sound of the musical instruments, the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you must fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The consequence for noncompliance is stated with brutal clarity. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. The furnace itself is visible from the assembly, a massive brick structure designed for smelting ore but now repurposed as execution device, its opening large enough to accommodate human bodies, smoke already rising from its interior where fires have been stoked to operational temperature in anticipation of the decree's enforcement. The message is unmistakable. This is not a request or a suggestion, but a command backed by the ultimate sanction: worship or burn, conform or die, with no middle ground permitted between obedience and annihilation. The music begins, the combined sound of multiple instruments creating an auditory signal that cannot be missed or misinterpreted, and like wheat bending before wind, the assembled officials prostrate themselves before the golden statue, thousands of men dropping to the ground in synchronized submission, foreheads pressed to the dust in worship of the image. But 3 figures remain standing, their vertical posture suddenly conspicuous in the sea of horizontal bodies, their refusal to bow as loud as any shouted declaration in the silence between musical phrases. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand with the stillness of men who have already calculated the cost and accepted it, their faces composed, their hands relaxed at their sides, giving no indication of fear or defiance, but simply the quiet determination of those whose deepest commitments have been activated by circumstances that permit no compromise. The Chaldean officials notice immediately, of course. Such obvious noncompliance cannot be hidden in an assembly orchestrated precisely for the purpose of demonstrating universal submission. Some of these officials bear grudges against the Jewish exiles who have risen to positions they covet. Resentment at foreigners occupying administrative roles that should belong to native Babylonians. And they seize this opportunity with malicious efficiency. They approach King Nebuchadnezzar with accusations framed to maximize royal anger. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. The charges are crafted to emphasize ingratitude and disloyalty. These men, whom the king personally elevated, now revealed as rebels who refuse the simplest demonstration of allegiance, their non-compliance framed not as religious scruple, but as political insurrection and personal insult to the monarch who showed them favor. Nebuchadnezzar's response is fury tinged with disbelief, rage at the defiance, but also, perhaps, disappointment that men he trusted have refused a command he considered reasonable. He orders them brought before him, still hoping perhaps that this is misunderstanding rather than deliberate rebellion, that a direct royal command will resolve what the general decree did not accomplish. The three Jews are brought from their positions in the assembly to stand before the king's presence, and Nebuchadnezzar addresses them with a mixture of threat and opportunity. Is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up? He offers them a second chance, a way to resolve this without the extreme sanction. When the music sounds again, fall down and worship the image, and all will be forgiven. But then the threat: if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And with the arrogance of absolute power, he adds the challenge that reveals his fundamental misunderstanding of what he faces. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? The response comes not from one, but collectively, the three speaking with unified conviction. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. The statement is not defiance, but clarity, a recognition that further discussion is pointless because their position is not negotiable. They continue with words that will echo through millennia as a declaration of faith under extreme duress. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. They affirm divine power without presuming to dictate divine action, acknowledging God's capability while remaining uncertain about God's intention in this specific circumstance. And then the core statement, the commitment that transcends even confidence in miraculous deliverance. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image you have set up. The conditional, but if not, carries enormous theological and psychological weight. They are prepared to maintain their commitment even if God does not intervene, even if the result is death by burning, even if faithfulness leads to suffering without rescue. This is faith stripped of bargaining and expectation management, belief that persists regardless of outcome, allegiance that does not depend on favorable results. They are not testing God or demanding proof of divine power, but simply refusing to violate their deepest convictions even when the cost is certain and terrible. The response infuriates Nebuchadnezzar precisely because it reveals the limits of his power. He can kill them, but he cannot compel the worship he demands, cannot force internal allegiance through external threat, cannot make them bow except physically, while their minds and hearts remain steadfastly oriented elsewhere. The king's face changes with rage, the text preserving the detail that his visage was distorted with anger toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fury transforming his features and his judgment. He orders the furnace heated 7 times more than was customary, an irrational command driven by emotion rather than practicality. The men will die just as certainly in a normally heated furnace. But Nebuchadnezzar wants their death to be more than execution, wants it to be annihilation, wants the flame so intense that even the memory of their rebellion is consumed. The strongest soldiers in his army are commanded to bind the 3 Jews and throw them into the furnace, and they comply, wrapping Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their full official garments, the cloaks and tunics and hats and all their clothing, perhaps because there is no time for the usual preparation of execution victims, perhaps because the king wants them cast in immediately, still dressed in the robes of office that now mark them as traitors rather than administrators. The execution should be straightforward, a matter of physically moving the condemned men from the king's presence to the furnace opening and casting them into the flames. But the furnace has been heated beyond rational temperatures, the flames so intense that they extend beyond the structure itself, superheated air creating a zone of lethal temperature around the opening. The soldiers who seize Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and carry them toward the furnace enter this thermal zone and die, the heat overwhelming their lungs and skin before they can retreat, their bodies collapsing as they complete their grim task, pushing the 3 bound Jews into the flames before falling themselves. The condemned tumble into the inferno still bound, still clothed, disappearing into fire so intense it killed their executioners, and Nebuchadnezzar watches from safe distance, expecting to see nothing more than the brief shadows of burning bodies and then ashes. But the king suddenly rises in alarm and confusion, staring into the furnace with an expression that combines disbelief and fear. He turns to his counselors with an urgent question. Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They confirm what he knows to be true, their agreement cautious because they sense his disturbance and do not understand its source. Nebuchadnezzar responds with words that defy rational explanation. But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. The impossible has manifested, not merely survival of flames that killed the soldiers who approached them, but freedom from the bonds that should have restrained them, mobility in an environment that should permit only instant death, and the presence of a 4th figure whose appearance suggests divine rather than human nature, a being whose manifestation in the furnace transforms execution into encounter. The king approaches the furnace opening as closely as the residual heat allows and shouts into the flames, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." The address is significant. He no longer calls them servants of his own authority, but acknowledges them as servants of a God whose power clearly exceeds his own, whose ability to preserve life in circumstances designed to destroy it demonstrates sovereignty that transcends imperial decree. The 3 men emerge from the furnace, walking out of flames that should have reduced them to ash in seconds, and the assembled officials, satraps and prefects and governors and the king's counselors, gather around them to examine the impossible evidence of their survival. The fire has not touched them. Their hair is not singed. Their robes show no burn marks. No smell of smoke clings to their clothing. They have been in the furnace, surrounded by flames intense enough to kill approaching soldiers, yet they emerge completely unharmed, as if the fire recognized some distinction that rendered them immune to its consuming nature. Nebuchadnezzar, confronted with undeniable evidence of power that supersedes his own, responds with a pronouncement that reverses his earlier challenge. "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him." The king who asked, "Who is the God who will deliver you now?" publicly acknowledges that such a God exists and has acted, that the 3 Jews were right to risk death rather than compromise their allegiance. He continues with remarkable self-awareness, noting that they set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Then comes the new decree, one that mirrors the structure of the worship command but inverts its content. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. The decree is typical of Nebuchadnezzar's approach to governance. Absolute and enforced by extreme violence, but it represents a genuine, if imperfect, recognition of divine power demonstrated through miraculous preservation. He cannot bring himself to worship the God of the Jews exclusively, cannot abandon the polytheistic framework that shapes Babylonian religion and politics, but he can acknowledge this particular deity as exceptionally powerful and worthy of protection through imperial law. It is conversion of a limited sort, recognition without full commitment, but it is nevertheless significant as a public reversal by the most powerful monarch in the world, a man not given to admitting error or acknowledging superior authority, now declaring that a foreign god demonstrated power beyond any he has previously encountered. The three Jews are restored to their administrative positions, their survival transforming them from condemned rebels into living testimonies of divine faithfulness. Their presence in the Babylonian bureaucracy now carrying different meaning, not just exiles who adapted successfully to foreign service, but men who maintained their deepest commitments, even when adaptation demanded too much, who found that faithfulness to their God was compatible with effective imperial service up to the precise point where it wasn't, and who chose correctly when forced to choose. Their example will echo through subsequent generations facing similar crises of conscience, providing a template for navigating the tension between accommodation and resistance, demonstrating that there are boundaries that must not be crossed even when the cost of refusal is death, and testifying that sometimes divine deliverance comes not by preventing the crisis, but by accompanying the faithful through it. Daniel, their friend and fellow exile, was notably absent from the dedication ceremony. The text does not explain where he was or why he was not forced to face the same choice, but his absence removes him from this particular crisis, even as it highlights the courage of his three companions, who faced it without his influential presence. Whether Daniel was traveling on royal business, or whether his position as chief of the wise men placed him outside the administrative hierarchy being tested, or whether Providence arranged his absence for reasons the narrative does not explore, the result is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego must navigate this crisis on their own resources and their own faith, without the benefit of Daniel's prophetic insight or his established relationship with the king. Their faithfulness is purely their own, not derived from or dependent on their more famous friend, and the miracle that preserves them is response to their individual commitment rather than reflected favor from Daniel's status. The psychological dimensions of their experience deserve consideration. What does it feel like to be bound and thrown into flames so intense they kill your executioners, expecting death but choosing faithfulness over apostasy? What passes through the mind in the seconds between being cast into the fire and recognizing that the flames are not consuming you? How do you process the appearance of the fourth figure, the being whose presence transforms the furnace from execution chamber into sanctuary, whose identity remains mysterious even as his function becomes clear? The text offers no introspection, no internal monologue, preserving only the external facts and the theological interpretation. But the human experience must have been profound. Terror transformed into wonder, acceptance of death giving way to miraculous preservation, the isolation of condemnation replaced by the presence of a companion who defies categorization, but whose effect is undeniable protection in the midst of destruction. The furnace itself becomes a theological image that transcends the specific historical incident, a symbol of trials that seem designed to destroy, but which can become instead the context for divine encounter and demonstration. The early church will see in this story a foreshadowing of Christian martyrdom and the promise that God accompanies believers through persecution. Jewish tradition will develop extensive interpretations exploring the identity of the fourth figure and the meaning of preservation through fire, rather than prevention from fire. The pattern repeats throughout salvation history. God's deliverance often comes not by removing the threat, but by sustaining the faithful through it. Not by preventing the furnace, but by entering it with them. Not by making the fire metaphorical, but by changing its nature so that what should destroy instead purifies, or demonstrates or reveals, without consuming. Years later, when Nebuchadnezzar's pride leads to his own humbling and temporary madness, when he is driven from human society to live like an animal, until he acknowledges that the Most High rules the kingdom of men. Perhaps he remembers the 3 Jews who stood when everyone else bowed, who walked in flames that should have killed them, who emerged unharmed and unchanged except by their vindication. Perhaps the memory contributes to his eventual restoration and the acknowledgement that comes after his sanity returns. I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. The trajectory of his life shows gradual movement toward recognition of divine sovereignty, beginning with the dream interpretation that revealed his empire's temporality, continuing through the furnace incident that demonstrated power beyond imperial control, and culminating in his own direct experience of being reduced and then restored by a God whose authority transcends every human throne. For Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the furnace becomes the defining moment of their lives, the incident by which they will always be known, the story that survives when other details of their careers and lives fade into historical obscurity. They are not remembered primarily as effective administrators or successful navigators of exile or examples of cultural adaptation, but as the men who refused to bow and survived the fire, whose faithfulness under extreme duress demonstrated something about the nature of true allegiance and the character of the God they served. The story is not ultimately about their courage, though they were certainly courageous, but about divine faithfulness, about a God who does not always prevent suffering, but who promises presence within it, who sometimes allows believers to face the furnace, but who accompanies them through the flames, who transforms instruments of death into testimonies of life, who makes the boundaries that seem fixed, between survival and destruction, between natural law and miraculous intervention, between what is possible and what is not, permeable enough for grace to work in ways that defy explanation, but which cannot be denied by those who witness them. The golden statue on the plain of Dura eventually succumbs to time and political change, melted down or dismantled when resources are needed for other projects, the moment of its dedication fading into history as empires always fade, as monuments to power prove less permanent than the powers they represent. But the story of 3 men who stood when everyone else bowed, who chose death over compromise, and found instead that their God met them in the fire, persists across millennia and cultures, retold whenever the powerful demand what conscience cannot give, whenever the choice comes between comfort and conviction, whenever people must decide whether their allegiances are negotiable or whether some commitments must be maintained regardless of cost. The furnace was heated 7 times beyond normal temperature, but it could not consume what God chose to preserve, could not destroy what divine presence protected, could not silence the testimony that would outlast the empire that tried to enforce worship through threat of burning, and which would continue to speak long after Babylon itself became a memory, and the plain of Dura returned to dust.